Hello, and welcome to another exciting live stream edition of Adam's Music Box. Oh boy. Well, today I want to talk about the fusion of modern rock music, and by that I mean sort of from the second part of the 20th century, and classical music, which is a term that we really need to define. Classical music means different things depending on who you ask. The term for what we at times call classical music today was previously called art music. So in the 19th century, art music was contrasted with folk music. I should really get one of those AM radio cough buttons, shouldn't I? So that was the contrast. You had the folk music, which generally was associated with the following things. Anyone with even limited musical training could play it or sing it for that matter. Anyone with limited musical training could compose it. Much of it was never written down. It took place in people's humble homes. It took place in, pubs and bars, village squares, etc. And then you had art music, which was composed by people who were fully musically literate. The harmony was sophisticated. It took immense musical skill to play it correctly. It was performed in the chambers, hence chamber music, of wealthy aristocrats. It was performed in churches, sacred places, and it was performed in concert halls where people would pay a lot more than just going down to the village pub to hear the music performed. Now, this music gradually came to be known as classical music, which opens up a whole other can of worms. So, classical music per se is the art music of any given culture. There is Indian classical music, there is African classical music, Japanese classical music, but generally, because of its overwhelming popularity, not in all cultures, but in many, when people say classical music, they tend to mean the art music that originated in Europe. And the reason for this is because you have a great deal of popularity of this music comparatively in Japan, in China, in India, and many of these countries have produced great musicians in the European classical tradition, despite not being of a European background. Think Seiji Ozawa, the Japanese conductor, think Zubin Mehta, the Indian conductor, just to name a very few. Now, within this, there are many subgenres of European classical music. And to make things even more confusing from there, one of these subgenres is called classical. So within this overarching thing called European classical music, you have early music, things like Gregorian chant. You have Renaissance music, things like Vivaldi. You have Baroque music, things like Bach. Then you have the classical period. You've got the early classical period and the high classical period. And the high classical period are people like Mozart and Haydn. And then you have the late classical period, which went into the romantic period. And here you have Beethoven, usually being signposted as the composer who began his life in the late classical era. And by the time he composes his Ninth Symphony, we're into the romantic era. Now, the Romantic era is when European classical music became very popular and became big business. One of the early Romantics was Schubert. Then you have Mendelssohn. Then you have Liszt, Schumann, and Wagner. Then you have the later Romantic period, which included a kind of neoclassicist romanticist like Brahms, and the more traditional late Romanticists, people like Bruckner and Richard Strauss. And of course, you had a lot of the entire Russian orchestral tradition, as opposed to the European one, only began in this Romantic era. And I did a whole other video on that, which you should definitely check out if you're interested in what makes Russian orchestral music, Russian classical, Russian Romantic music, what makes that style of playing so different from its European counterpart. I thought I needed to sneeze there, but luckily that's passed. Now, I told you that these definitions, while they might seem a bit tedious, they're actually quite important because colloquially, many people take classical music to mean anything that uses the standard instrumentation of the European classical orchestra. Now, what is this? It's a large string section divided into five parts. There are two violin sections known as the first and second violins. There's a cello section, a viola section, and a bass section, the contrabasso. And then, of course, you have your standard woodwind instruments, your oboe, your bassoon, your cor anglais, aka English horn, your flute, your piccolo, and variations thereof. And you have your brass instruments, your trumpets, your French horns, your trombones, your tubas, and of course, percussion, which in the European classical tradition, the most common percussion instrument is the timpani, otherwise known as the kettle drum. Now, putting instruments in this combination onto a recording or into a performance does not make it classical music. It might make it like classical music, but very often it's pop music. My favorite Frank Sinatra album is Sinatra and Strings, orchestrated, arranged by one of the great arrangers of all time, a wonderful musician called Don Costa. Now, this was Sinatra with a full orchestral string section and other instruments that were, of course, borrowed from the European classical tradition, because the American and European pop music tradition owes a great deal to both European folk music, to jazz, and to European classical music. And on Sinatra and Strings, you can hear influences from all of that. And of course, lots of pop music and what we now call classic pop. Think your Sinatras, your Bing Crosbys, your Dean Martins, your Perry Comas, your Andy Williamses, and you hear a lot of this instrumentation. Now, soul music, R&B music, rock and roll music, blues music, and jazz music began using instruments not necessarily associated with this. They used to say strings don't swing. And so you had in jazz and also in a lot of early R&B and a lot of early rock and roll, a musical instrument that was invented with the purpose of being in the European classical orchestra, but for reasons that were really more commercial than artistic, it wasn't. And this was the saxophone. When Adolf Sax invented this in Belgium in the 19th century, he intended this instrument to join in with all of your bassoons and your flutes and your trumpets and your trombones in the orchestra. But because of various licensing agreements and publishing agreements, and the fact that some of the instrument makers were also the publishers, there was something of a conspiracy to keep the saxophone out of the orchestra. But it found home elsewhere. It found a home in military bands and marching bands. It found a home in what in the 20th century became concert bands, which were a concert version of the European military band and the North American marching band. It found a home, though, most famously in jazz music. Jazz musicians loved it because it was an instrument that was able to cut through an audience. So even if you were playing in small numbers, it had a prominent sound, it had a wide range, and it gave people the flexibility to improvise in ways that the violin just never really. There was jazz violin, but the saxophone was the instrument of choice for most of these great improvisers who blew into something as opposed to played something with their hands and hands alone in the world of jazz. The same was true of early R&B and early rock and roll. The saxophone was very, very prominent as both a solo instrument and, frankly, as a overall lead instrument. Think Bill Haley and the Comets. Think of Elvis's use of saxophone in early rock and roll. And so we see, of course, how sometimes genres are just as much defined by their instrumentation as by the actual composition or the style of performance. So, with that long preamble now safely out of the way, let's talk about fusion music. Now, the term fusion tended to enter the lexicon when people were talking about the fusion of modern jazz and modern rock. And we could say that Tony Williams, with his Emergency album, invented fusion. We could say that Miles Davis, when he started to get electric instruments on with things like Miles in the Sky, and more famously later with a large myriad of electric instruments on Bitches Brew, you could say that was the beginning of fusion. But as John McLaughlin, the great fusion guitarist who played with Miles, played with Tony Williams, and of course founded his own quintessential fusion band, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, he said that every form of music is fusion music because it's all about combining different influences that weren't necessarily combined before. And so let's look at the fusion of orchestral music and rock music because for a while there were a lot of bands that did a lot of this. Now, the Beatles, of course, had access to orchestral instruments by virtue of the fact that they had made a lot of money selling the early albums, which didn't have much more than the instruments the four Beatles played themselves. And they also had access to Abbey Road Studios, which had a Rolodex of all of the session musicians in London, including many who played in orchestras, whether the Royal Philharmonic, London Symphony Orchestra, Philharmonia, etc. So you see the Beatles begin to use a lot more orchestral instrumentation, but the Beatles never fully fused orchestral music and rock and roll music, but other bands did. And one of my favorite early examples of this was the one of the best albums of all time, bar none, 1967's Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues. Now, this album, weirdly, was designed by the record company DRAM Records to be a literal fusion of romantic music, romantic European classical music, and rock music, because they wanted the Moody Blues to perform a rock version of Dvorak's New World Symphony. Sometimes it's called the Fifth, sometimes it's called the Ninth. We won't open that can of worms today. And the band said, well, we'd rather do something different. We'd rather incorporate a full orchestra into our original music. And that's what they did. And it worked really, really well. And to make the textures even richer, some of the sounds that sounded orchestral were provided by the what was called, pardon me, a group of session musicians who, for that one gig, called themselves the London Festival Orchestra. And some of it was provided by Mike Pinder's brilliant Mellotron. A Mellotron, for those who haven't seen the video on that, was a keyboard instrument that is sometimes referred to as an early sampler. Tapes, regular old tapes, were put into the machine through a very special set of machinery, specially made heads, specially recorded tapes, and these tapes recorded. These tapes contain recordings of all of your standard orchestral and folk and rock instruments playing up the scale. So you had a solo violin tape, violin section tape, trumpet section tape, organ tape, guitar tape, percussion tapes. And they were all in this very heavy keyboard instrument. And if you pressed middle C and had it set for violin section, you would hear a violin section playing the middle C. If you selected on your Mellotron organ, you would hear an organ sound, and etc. And Mike Pinder, because he worked in the Mellotron factory, he knew this instrument inside and out, how to maintain it, how to repair it, which a lot of people didn't know. And so this album was a fusion of a rock band with an unusual instrument that sounds like an orchestra if it wants to, and with Mike Pinder playing it, it really did want to quite a lot, and a real orchestra. Around the same time, the band The Nice was incorporating all sorts of classical music into theirs. Now, The Nice was technically a trio and then a quartet, just guitar, bass, drums, and Keith Emerson as the star on his Hammond organ. And Keith was equally a fan of jazz and classical music, and he incorporated both. He incorporated things like Bach, Brandenburg Concerto. He incorporated Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, the Pathetique. He incorporated the Karelia Suite of Sibelius. And they recorded an album called Five Bridges where they played live with a traditional symphony orchestra. Days of Future Past was obviously a studio album, making things easier. The Five Bridges suite was live. And why was this difficult? Well, stage monitoring systems at that time weren't as nearly sophisticated as they would eventually become. And this meant that you had a constant clash between an amplified rock band and an unamplified orchestra. So when the orchestra was playing a loud tutti, meaning together passage, the orchestra could sound as loud or louder as the rock band. But if it was just the string section and the string section alone, or a portion of the string section playing with the rock band, you got into some trouble. But that did not deter our great pioneers of orchestral rock fusion, because just around the corner was an aspiring composer and fellow organist like Keith Emerson called John Lord. And John Lord was in a band that had already had a lot of success called Deep Purple. And he composed something called the Concerto for Group and Orchestra. And he worked alongside one of the great contemporary English composers and conductors, Sir Malcolm Arnold. And the result was a piece designed for a full, large symphony orchestra and a rock band containing an organist, John Lord, a guitarist, Richie Blackmore, a drummer, Ian Pace, bassist, Roger Glover, and vocalist, Ian Gillan. And the orchestra that was hired to perform this live, um, they weren't really into it. They didn't like the music per se. They found the sonic balance of between the orchestra and the rock band difficult, but Malcolm Arnold was very, very supportive of John Lord. He knew that this young man really had a great amount of talent. He was chasing his dream and he made it happen. And luckily for the world, it was on video and released on record as the Concerto for Group and Orchestra. And to this day is considered, for all of the logistical difficulties and some of the pouting by some of the orchestra members that went into it, it remains known as one of the most successful examples of these. Now, Arnold and Lord collaborated for a follow up called the Gemini Suite, which is in some ways even better, but it wasn't as successful. Some say the novelty wore off. And so Richie Blackmore said, he said, look, if this Gemini Suite isn't a huge hit, let's just get back to playing what we play as a band. And that's what they did for most of the rest of their career. And the rest is history. Deep Purple went on to bigger and bigger heights. Now, remember that name Keith Emerson from earlier? Well, he left the Nice and formed a new band called Emerson, Lake and Palmer, a kind of supergroup. And what they were was a fusion band of European classical, literal European classical music, and progressive rock. Their second ever album was a reimagining of Modest Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, arranged for rock and roll trio. They played Tchaikovsky a bit on that same album. Their first album, a song called The Barbarian, which opens that up, the Allegro Barbaro of Bartok. They did so much with this classical influence. They quoted on the Brain Salad Surgery album, the Argentinian composer Ginastera. And there's so much that Emerson, Lake and Palmer did with this rock and roll classical fusion. And Greg Lake, the vocalist, bass player, and sometimes guitar player for the band, he was asked, what is Emerson, Lake and Palmer's legacy? And he said, if anything, I would have hoped that this band, which was very popular in the 70s, I would hope that the legacy of this band was to introduce classical music to new audiences. I think that's quite a profound statement of what ELP represented. Now, for most of ELP's career, they didn't play with any other musicians on stage other than themselves. They were rearranging all of this classical music for a three-piece band, and they were composing often in that style. Check out Keith Emerson's piano solo on the song Trilogy. Sounds a lot like late European romantic music. Now, at the end of the 70s, they did tour with an orchestra, and they filmed a famous concert in the infamous Montreal Olympic Stadium. In that year, it bankrupted them, but it was quite an artistic success. It was somewhat easier for them to achieve that balance than it was for Deep Purple 10 years earlier. And Keith Emerson also wrote a traditional piano concerto in a modernist style that was accompanied by the orchestra. They did a studio version of that as well, and they really probably pushed this fusion of classical further than just about anyone. Then there was a band called Beggars Opera, a Scottish progressive rock band, and they were very much into this fusion of of rock and classical. And they did a piece of music called Raymond's Road, which borrowed from so many classical themes. It borrowed from Sibelius, it borrowed from Giacomo Rossini. They did so much of this. They did Franz von Suppe's Poet and Peasant Overture, a really cool band. They also did a very cool prog rock version of MacArthur Park. There was the English band Renaissance, which did a whole piece of prog rock based on Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade. And there are many such examples of this. I know that I'm forgetting a lot of them. And then we see another phenomenon emerge, which sort of takes us back to where we were in the Sinatra era, which is music that was composed with songs originally intended to be performed by a small pop combo, a jazz combo, meaning a small jazz band, small pop band. Only we see this in the rock and roll realm. We see rock bands going on stage with orchestras, even though the music isn't necessarily intended for this. There was sort of an interim stage where on the song Stargazer on Rainbow's second album. We see the Munich Philharmonic accompany Deep Purple on the song, but the arrangement was relatively simple. They were low in the mix. Ritchie's guitar really stole the day, but Ritchie was, in his own way, doing what he didn't like necessarily John Lord for doing earlier. And Ritchie has integrated a lot of classical music, including Beethoven, into his solos. He's a huge, I think one of his favorite pieces, he said, is the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, and he really integrated that into a lot of his solos, and he integrated in a lot of Baroque music. And once he got tired of the rock and roll game, he played in a band that sort of fused Baroque and Renaissance music, mainly Renaissance music and folkish traditions that were in medieval and Renaissance Europe with sort of a rock sensibility. And this was called Blackmore's Night. So he kind of came full circle on that. And of course, you see many bands that play with orchestra. Yes, played with an orchestra twice. They did it once on the Time and a Word album from 71, where relatively sophisticated orchestral parts were written to accompany music that was otherwise able to be performed exclusively as a band. It was a really good album, Time and a Word. And then again, they did something similar in the early 2000s with the album Magnification. Metallica has played with orchestras many times, beginning in, I think, the very end of the 90s or early 2000s with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. And some bands have done it with more success than others, and there's several factors to consider. One are the orchestral parts designed to bookend the rock and roll parts, as they partly were with the Moody Blues and Days of Future Past, and some extent were with Deep Purple. There were sections of Deep Purple's Concerto for Orchestra where it was just the band, sections when it was just the orchestra, and sections when they played together. With Keith Emerson and his piano concerto, that was fully integrated. And Keith also pretty well integrated them into their version of Keith's arrangement, orchestration of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, when they did a version of that on the 77 tour, when they were going around the world with an orchestra. Procol Harum in 72 played in a relatively small town called Edmonton in Canada. And they created really surprisingly integrated arrangements, orchestrations of their songs for orchestra. And some would say that the version of Conquistador that they did on that live album with the Edmonton Orchestra was even more beloved than the one from the debut album. Then there are other examples of strings or other orchestral instruments serving as more of a background to the music, something that isn't integral to the music like it was for ELP and to an extent Deep Purple, and to an extent, yes, with Time and a Word, but stuff that's just sort of there to add flourishes. You'll see for instances, the Alan Parsons Project, when they became a live outfit, they played with orchestra. But even though the orchestrations were very rich in texture, they were really adding musical color to the songs that were never intended to be played with orchestra. And so you had the original arrangements of the keyboards and guitar and vocals and percussion from the original Alan Parsons Project album, and then the orchestra added sort of flourishes and added dynamic richness, dynamic texture to it. And there's so many other instances of this that it almost has become a cliche, because there was one time where it seemed that every aging rock band that needed a bit of a dynamic boost and needed something on to print on the ticket and on the poster to indicate that this is something more than usual, they would play with an orchestra. And those sorts of incidences kind of ruined this genre. It kind of made it seem a bit tacky, a bit corny. But don't forget the true pioneers who first did this at a time when, even though pop musicians, especially vocalists like your Sinatras, were used to be backed by orchestras as arranged by very respected musicians, people like Don Costa. There was, because of rock and roll's rebellious selling point, or some would say its rebellious attitude, a lot of orchestras who came from an older tradition were musically literate, where some rock bands weren't musically literate. All that means is you can read music. You don't need to be able to read music to be a great musician. Mussorgsky was borderline musically literate by classical standards. He was one of the best composers ever. So there you go. And so, don't get me wrong, he was musically literate, but he was more or less self-taught, as were many of the Russian composers. And so, look at the true pioneers, the Keith Emersons, the Moody Blues, the Yeses of the world, stuff George Martin did for the Beatles. Don't leave that out. Procol Harum with their great Edmonton album. And you can see that at least in the 60s and 70s, orchestral music and what we would call rock or prog rock music were really a hell of a lot closer they are today. So, reminder, this is a new channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know how many videos you want me to put out a day. I'm kind of settling on 2, and then at the weekends, I might just do the live streams. Maybe I'll put out 2 regular videos and a live stream. But I think for the weekdays, I'll settle on 2. But let me know in the comments what you think. Is 2 too much? Is 2 more than enough? Is 2 a good number? Obviously, if there's some breaking news or something in the world of music, I'll always do more. So let me know what you think. Your feedback's always important. Support me on Ko-Fi. Share with your friends. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.